NATO has made some pretty bad decisions that led to this. But now Ukraine is forcing NATO to rethink everything. Welcome to America Uncovered. I'm Chris Chappell. Last week, NATO leaders met in Washington, D.C. and celebrated NATO's 75th anniversary. But there's a good chance you might not have picked up on it. We were all a bit distracted at the time. No, not by the failed Trump assassination. That hadn't happened yet. I'm talking about Democratic Party leaders wanting to replace Biden for making repeated and embarrassing gaffes like this.
And now I want to hand it over to the president of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin.
But there were some important things that came out of the NATO summit, especially when it came to Ukraine, which, as a reminder, is not a NATO member. Among them is the Washington Summit Declaration. In the declaration is the decision to coordinate the provision of military equipment and training for Ukraine, make a pledge of long-term security assistance for Ukraine, to continue funding Ukraine at a minimum of $43 billion within the next year, and appoint a NATO senior representative in Ukraine. NATO members also announced that the first F-16 jet fighters are on their way and will be operational in Ukraine by the end of this summer, which is insanely generous for a country that isn't even a member. Ukraine will reportedly have somewhere between 60 to 80 of these fighter jets by the end of the year. This is in addition to 5 additional air defense systems, including Patriot batteries that Biden announced earlier at the summit, and the U.S. announcement of a new $2.3 billion military aid package a week earlier. While Ukraine most certainly welcomed this news, these alone likely won't tip the scales in the conflict in Ukraine. As a matter of fact, Ukraine has long been frustrated with the U.S. over its F-16 pilot training. According to Politico, the F-16 pilot training programs just don't have enough capacity. A total of 20 Ukrainian F-16 pilots are expected to graduate by the end of this year, half of the 40 needed to operate a full squadron of 20 jets. So why is NATO giving Ukraine 60 to 80 jets? But even if Ukraine had trained pilots for all the F-16s delivered, they'd still be outnumbered by Russia's numerically superior air force. This is to say that the US and Europe have been taking a slow, incremental approach in supporting Ukraine to prevent escalation with Russia. But in doing so, it seems like NATO is only helping Ukraine fight, but not win. So a little history is in order to really understand how Ukraine has changed NATO and how the situation got to where it is now. Because as it turns out, you can't summarize decades of geopolitics in a meme. I know, I tried. Surprised this didn't go viral. Back in 2008, NATO held a summit in Bucharest where it declared Georgia and Ukraine would eventually join NATO, though it gave no timeline or plan to execute this momentous decision. Ukraine's dedication to NATO membership declined significantly beginning in 2010, until the Euromaidan in 2014 when the president of Ukraine was ousted. Ukraine then reoriented to NATO. And when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, support for joining NATO increased a lot. NATO reaffirmed its commitment to Ukraine during the Madrid summit in 2022, a few months after Russia invaded. And NATO hasn't quite been the same since. You see, for a long time, there was an idea that NATO was kind of obsolete. The Cold War was over. We could all do business now, even if it was with dictators. People called it the end of history. The liberal democratic world order won. So why should NATO countries spend a bunch of money on defense? There's no way a war with Russia was going to happen now, right? Right? This was actually a major issue during the Trump administration. The U.S. was covering a majority of the NATO defense budget. So in 2018, Trump suggested the other NATO countries should boost their defense spending. He also warned against energy dependence on Russia and singled out the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which would make countries like Germany Russia's captive. Germans laughed at Trump for warning against relying on Russian oil. Germans assumed they could go on living as though they're at the end of history, and they could totally work with people like Russian leader Vladimir Putin. After all, why couldn't they just be good neighbors? But surprise, surprise, people like Putin want more than just trade. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg admitted earlier this year that Europe made a mistake of becoming dependent on Russian oil and gas. But the Ukraine war forced NATO countries to call for ramping up ammunition production, address the risk of mineral shortages, and to adapt a military posture that can tackle modern warfare. And yes, NATO even raised its defense spending. These are things that were unthinkable 10 years ago. As for believing we can all just get along with authoritarian countries, NATO now recognizes that they are becoming a unified axis attempting to undermine the West. That's why NATO is now criticizing Iran for providing UAVs to Russia's war, and criticizing North Korea for providing artillery shells and ballistic missiles. NATO also called out China.
China provides dual-use equipment, microelectronics, a lot of other tools which are enabling Russia to build the missiles, to build the bombs, to build the aircraft, to build the weapons they are using to attack Ukraine.
So this means that China is a threat to our security.
That's what China Uncensored's Chris Chappell has been saying for years. I guess better late than never. People really should listen to that guy. Makes a lot of good points. These are all major changes that would have never happened to NATO had it not been for Ukraine. And it's a good thing they're wising up, otherwise this really might have been the end of history, and not in a good way. If you like America Uncovered's nonpartisan take on news and politics, be sure to subscribe, smash that like button, and support the show on Patreon. All it takes is $1 an episode. Just click that orange button. I'm also trying to get around YouTube censorship by hiding controversial topics in gaming content. Check out the latest episode of my new show, Deep Thoughts While Gaming. It's about Detroit Become Human, and it's called If a Robot Identifies as a Woman. It's fun. Give it a click. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching America Uncovered.